Hi, everybody. I'm Tom Yazgirdi, president of AFSA. Thank you for joining us today and your summer lunch hour. We appreciate that. I'm sure this event today is going to produce a real interesting discussion. And I just want to say that today's event is educational, not promotional in nature. But we really believe AFSA members will benefit from today's event, so we're honored to host it. Today's featured author is an 8-year member of the AFSA governing board, Steve Herman. It's not every day that we have an AFSA board member who publishes a book, so we're really excited to be able to do this. And Steve Herman is here today for the conversation. He's a longtime Foreign Service officer, a veteran journalist at the Voice of America, including serving as its White House correspondent during the previous administration. And of course, that is the title of the book, Behind the White House Curtain. Steve has a fascinating story to tell, I'm sure, and I'm glad you're here to listen to it. Our moderator today is a great friend of AFSA and a familiar face, Eric Rubin, my predecessor as AFSA president. For those of you who missed it, Eric wrote a great review of Steve's book in the June 2024 edition of the Foreign Service Journal. So I recommend that you check it out. And he seemed to be, for us, a natural choice to have this conversation with Steve. So again, thank you very much for participating with us today. And Eric, over to you.
Thanks a lot, Tom, and welcome everybody, and good afternoon. I'm really glad to be back with AFSA Book Notes, and I'm really glad you could join us. This, as Tom mentioned, is a special pleasure for us because one of our longtime board members is the author of the book we'll be discussing today, and it's a particularly timely book to discuss because it touches really on two very important themes. One is Steve Herman's career as a journalist, as a foreign correspondent, as a Washington correspondent, and as someone who feels very strongly about and talks very eloquently about the importance of the free press in our society. And that's a topic that I think is especially relevant as we head into the final stages of our presidential campaign and other campaigns. The book is also about a critical period when Steve was chief White House correspondent. I was president of AFSA at the time. And we all went through a lot of challenges, both in terms of the Foreign Service and AFSA and our membership, but also the Voice of America, the Agency for Global Media, and the entire White House press corps in covering a tumultuous time, I would call it, in a neutral sense, in American history, in American journalism, in American foreign policy. The book that Steve has written, Behind the White House Curtain, gets into many angles that are worth exploring in that regard. He does talk about what it was like to be targeted as a journalist, doing his job covering the White House in a dispassionate and objective manner, but still in very polarized times, coming under fire for political reasons. I think it's fair to say. He also talks about the importance of journalism in our system, the fact that we don't have a government propaganda ministry. American journalism, American media is the way that Americans learn about what's happening in their country, what their government is doing, what's working, what's not working. It's a critical function, even more critical in the current environment, and one that has also changed a lot over the years and is still undergoing a lot of change and stress. So there's lots to talk about, and I'll have a few questions before we open it up to audience questions, but why don't we turn over to Steve now for some opening remarks about the book. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you, Eric. It's a pleasure to be here today. And as you have some indication, I am in a unique situation wearing a number of different hats as a correspondent, someone who works for the Voice of America, which is 100% part of the federal government, but is under an independent agency. And even between our parent agency and VOA, there exists a firewall, and encoded in the law is a mandate for us to be fair and objective and not reflect the view of any one particular administration, but to tell America's story to the world. I came into VOA. I'd been a contract reporter in Tokyo, and I was offered a position in New Delhi, India, and it was a foreign service position. I did not understand at the time the distinction between being a correspondent, a civil servant, foreign service, and I really got no introduction. There's no beginner's class for the VOA Foreign Service, and I was just thrown into it and had to learn the sort of administrative rules in the process. The Foreign Service correspondents of VOA are a legacy of a time when the Voice of America was under the U.S. Information Agency. And so we still have these foreign correspondents, but the majority of FSOs under USAGM are technicians and engineers who work at the transmitter sites. All but one of those are overseas. That's sort of the basic outline as far as the book is concerned. I vowed I was not going to write a book as a White House correspondent. I sort of figured in the last 6 months of the Trump administration, there were probably dozens of White House reporters sitting in the briefing room when they had a few free moments working on their own manuscripts. But what happened is when I would go out to give lectures at universities or talk to community groups, I noticed that what people seemed the most interested in were the sort of behind the scenes episodes. What's it like to go into the Oval Office? What's it like to fly into Air Force One? And I realized there really wasn't a book out there that spoke to these things. And so it's a very different kind of book about covering the White House. And I also wanted to put it into historical context. Yes, the Trump administration and the President of the United States calling the press the enemy of the people, the sort of combat that seemed to go on verbally between the president, the press secretary, and members of the press corps. To a lot of people, they had never seen anything like this before. You know, the briefings at the White House are usually not must-see afternoon television with being carried on the commercial networks, but that would happen from time to time. And what I realized in doing the research for the book about how the relationship had evolved over the decades and centuries between the press and the president, and George Washington in his second term was being called a tyrant, a traitor, senile, a thief by the Virginia Republican leaning newspapers. So some things are new and some things are not new. And what we have today, where the president comes out and speaks to reporters on the record, and that these news conferences or briefings are televised live. Obviously, the television aspect is a fairly recent technological innovation, but through most of the history of the Republic, there was not this sort of on-the-record interaction between the presidents and the press. And so I thought it was really important to explain all this, put it into context. And yes, as Eric mentioned, I do talk about what happened in the last administration where the White House was targeting VOA and USAGM for their own type of reform. We can see a hint of that possibly for a Trump 2.0 that's outlined in Project 2025. There's 11 pages on USAGM and VOA. I guess we should be flattered to get so many pages in that document. So, you know, that's something that we're all obviously looking at very closely. And, you know, I'll be happy to answer questions on that. So back to you, Eric.
Thank you, Steve. I had some background in the White House press room as assistant White House press secretary for foreign affairs in the Clinton administration, which was a very different time. First of all, as you mentioned, there was a lot more off the record interaction, but there was also much more of a sense that the elected officials, including the president, had an obligation to talk to the press, to the electronic media, as part of the basic ground rules in our society. And that obviously has broken down in a bipartisan way, I think. We're not partisan at AFSA, and your book is not partisan, but things have changed in the sense not just calling the media the enemy, but also walling it off from the kind of indirect interaction, informal interaction that used to happen much more frequently, which led to a more informed public, I think. So lots of books could be written about how that happened, and that's not why we're here. I thought it'd be good to start out with an obvious question. This has been a very slow news month so far. Nothing significant has happened of note. But anyway, we should still take note of where we are in terms of events and news. And I wonder, based on some of the lessons that you draw from your experience across your career, but especially in the White House, if you had some thoughts about where we are and what we're looking at in terms of the role of the media in the next 4 months during the campaign and potentially in the next presidential administration.
Yeah, great question. I've said recently, I think the one thing, and perhaps the only thing that Joe Biden and Donald Trump agree on is they don't like their press coverage. And the media seems to be more and more the scapegoat or a target or under a tremendous amount of scrutiny. Of course, the media should be under scrutiny at any time. Um, it's a challenging situation, but I think also one thing that's important to point out, there's this impression that the White House press corps is somehow quite monolithic, and it is not. And I think it's probably even more diverse than it was when you were there, Eric. We have these sort of all online publications that have popped up. Many of them are taking quite a partisan view of things, and so to just paint the White House press corps with one broad brush, I think is very unfair. But if as somebody who looks at social media frequently, there's a lot of criticism of the media. Of course, in the right-wing media, we're the obvious accusations that are thrown at the media regarding Donald Trump. And then recently, the mainstream media was accused of orchestrating this movement to pressure Joe Biden to quote unquote pass the torch. And I can tell you, as someone who's worked inside the media for 45 years or so, that there's not a cabal. Yes, there might be some kind of groupthink. The background of most of the mainstream journalists inside the Beltway, they tend to be people who came from upper middle class families, who went to rather elite universities, et cetera, et cetera. So I've always advocated that we need to have more diversity in terms of a background and socioeconomic class of the reporters that are coming in to cover Washington. But I expect that between now and November 5th, at least I know that J.D. Vance is already out on the campaign trail and attacking the media. We'll see if if Kamala Harris perceives that she's getting some honeymoon period. Obviously, there's going to be a lot of sort of positive coverage of Harris popping out there as a new candidate in the Democratic National Convention. But I think right after that, you're going to see some more critical and objective reporting of the Democratic Party ticket. And one story I'm working on today, as a matter of fact, is who's going to be Harris's VP pick. And one concern I've heard from an analyst who we interviewed is that this is going to be a very rushed process, and the vetting may not be as thorough as it would be during a normal campaign. And there could possibly be something in the background of whoever is chosen. We've seen this in the past, right, with presidential and vice presidential candidates. And then if this is exposed, that didn't come out during the vetting, the press, rather than being lauded for it, will be criticized, by Democratic figures for trying to sabotage, the Harris ticket. I fully expect we'll see that sort of criticism coming at us.
Thanks. Yes, those of us who are old enough, even when we were kids, remember 1972 and the fiasco with Senator Eagleburger as the vice presidential nominee, which was rushed. I hadn't thought about that, but thanks for flagging that, because that makes some sense, unfortunately. The context of your book, obviously, you focus on this critical period when you were covering the Trump White House, but the background is your work as a correspondent, your work with VOA and before. I wonder, since VOA's chief mission remains providing objective news and analysis about our country to the rest of the world, which is now a slightly different mission than it was in the day of shortwave, but still a very critical mission. If you could talk about, you mentioned the demise of the U.S. Information Agency, which many of us think was unfortunately a great loss and a big mistake. I guess it's maybe a softball question to say, how are we doing in communicating to the rest of the world? Because I think there's enough room for criticism on many levels, but I'd be curious how you think, the world is watching us. They've been watching every step of this drama because it affects them, affects everybody. And everybody in the world practically knows who the President of the United States is. I was just mentioning to someone I was in Buffalo for a work meeting a few months ago, and you can be 3 miles from the Canadian border and stop at a gas station and say, who's the Prime Minister of Canada? And you're lucky. You're not even going to find one person who has the slightest clue, even though they get Canadian TV and radio. They're just American. They have no idea. And you go right across the border, 10 inches into Canada, who's the President of the United States? Even the toddlers know. So, the whole world is focused on us. And I wonder, in terms of trends, in terms of explaining our country and its politics to the world, what you might want to highlight.
Yeah, I think VOA has been fairly consistent since we went on the air in 1942. Our first language was German, second was Japanese, and in that very first broadcast in German, the audience was told that whether the news is good or bad, we're going to tell you what it is. And that was a very novel concept because we had the Nazi propaganda broadcasts coming into living rooms in the United States, and it obviously was not an objective assessment of what was happening in Europe. And then, of course, Radio Tokyo came along as well, which was used as a propaganda vehicle, mainly targeting the U.S. Military forces that were in the Pacific. So that was something that was very, very significant, I think, especially putting it in the context of the times. And then There was a struggle, as I say, for VOA's soul after World War II ended, because you had a lot of people up on Capitol Hill that said, hey, the war's over. The government shouldn't be in the broadcasting business, right? This should be a private sector business, and we especially should never target U.S. citizens. And so there was something enacted called the Smith-Mundt Act, which walled off VOA from any domestic distribution. And there was a feeling that VOA, in light of what was starting in the Soviet Union, Radio Moscow, that we needed to have a voice going out there to the rest of the world. So the languages have changed over the decades. There's no longer a German service or a Japanese service. There's Bangla, Burmese, Swahili, Urdu, Pashto, Dari, Korean, etc. And and I can also tell you, during the late 1960s, if you speak with people who are from Eastern Europe, notably, who grew up listening to the Voice of America and our sister broadcaster, Radio Free Europe, they will tell you that they thought it was remarkable that these broadcasts out of the United States, VOA notably, were talking about the strife going on in the United States, the struggles in civil society, the discrimination against African Americans. And for a lot of people, a light bulb went off in their head. It's like, hey, we only hear one side of the story from our government broadcaster, government media, but we're hearing about the United States, warts and all, and that really gave them the concept of what democracy was about. I've been to North Korea as a VOA correspondent, and was interacting with the Panmunjom mission of the Korean People's Army during our time in Pyongyang, and they all acknowledged that they listen to VOA and Radio Free Asia. They didn't really know the difference between the two. It was all Mikuki Radio, American radio, to them, which is broadcast on medium wave and shortwave at night, one of the few places we still beam shortwave and AM radio into, because probably Kim Jong-un's the only one that can watch our stuff on the internet or via satellite TV. Now, of course, the North Korean military personnel that I interacted with thought, because I spoke a few words of Korean, I could order beer in Korean and my generality. So I had to be CIA, of course, but they also told me that they knew that CNN is scripted by the CIA as well. So even in places where there is suspicion about what we're doing and why we're doing it, we still have audiences. And again, there have been administrations over the decades that did not like that VOA was showing American society, warts and all, to the rest of the world. That is our mission, to tell America's story to the rest of the world. That's in the charter. That was a law passed and signed by President Ford. And so for those who feel that VOA should be the voice of any administration or a propaganda service, that would require an act of Congress to change it. So for those of us who, just like, anybody else who works for the government, we swear an allegiance to the Constitution, not to a president. If someone we feel is doing something illegal, we're going to make a stink about it. And we have done that in the past, obviously.
Thanks. In the book, obviously, you talk a lot about your time in the Trump White House and some of the pressures you came under and some of your colleagues came under for precisely the reason you're discussing. You also talk somewhat about what the atmosphere was like inside the Voice of America, inside the Agency for Global Media. Unlike the BBC, which is totally independent, funds its domestic operations, at least from license fees, pretty much is disliked by every government in power in the United Kingdom, whoever it is, because they're totally independent. You do have this tension that you discuss, where VOA's charter is very clear that it has to report independently, and yet It is funded with government money. It has appointees by the White House, some confirmed by the Senate, in charge. And in other respects, for example, the fact that there are US government editorials broadcast on VOA separate from the news operation, it can get complicated, and it did get complicated in the Trump administration, and it wasn't the first time. So I wonder if you could just further address a little more some of those tensions.
Yeah, well, I think we were fortunate in a way that the previous administration didn't really get around to putting too much attention on us until the third year and left in the political appointees from the Obama administration. But when the Trump administration appointees came in, they were looking to move fast and break things. There was absolutely no doubt about that whatsoever. And I think, as may be the case in other government agencies, where somebody political at the top comes in and wants to totally restructure things and expects everyone's going to march to their orders, they were stymied in a sense because there were immediate objections raised by the leadership, the career SES folks who were on the top, and from the rank and file as well, the journalists in the newsroom who did not believe that our coverage was biased and resented essentially being told to change what they were doing to please the political appointees. Um, as I said, it wasn't unprecedented that this happened in the Trump administration. There were some issues. Charles Z. Wick was an appointee of Ronald Reagan, who came in and definitely wanted to change things around too. But in the case of the Trump administration, it became very serious because a lot of people were fired at the top layers of US AGM, and a number of them became whistleblowers, and I became a whistleblower from the VOA newsroom, and we were really fortunate in the sense that we had bipartisan support on Capitol Hill. There were Republicans as well as Democrats who were upset with the way things were happening and what was happening. And we went to, we were very fortunate to have some very powerful and influential lawyers take our cases on pro bono and go to federal court and get a federal, ruling, injunctions that kept things the way that they had traditionally been. And then there was subsequently Office of Special Counsel report. I think there was another investigative report. I referenced those in the book as well, who had some concerns, but all in all, generally said, look, what was going on was a violation of the firewall, and these sort of firings and investigations and retaliations should not have happened. So we were very fortunate. The clock ran out, and Joe Biden on day one made some immediate changes. Now, there have also been changes to the structure. Subsequently, the VOA director is now not a presidential appointee. Mike Abramowitz, who just came in, was recommended by the USAGM CEO Amanda Bennett, who used to be the head of the VOA. And this was approved by what's called the International Broadcasting Advisory Board, IBAB, which seems to be a little bit more than advisory, and it's a bipartisan board, sort of like you see in other independent government agencies, their oversight mechanism. If then we'll see what happens in the next president of the United States, whoever that may be, if they want to see leadership changes at US AGM and VOA, how that goes. I think we're in some uncharted waters here, and we can look at, as I said, Project 2025. There's a blueprint there for what the Heritage Foundation and 100 plus conservative groups want to do. And we don't know yet what a Kamala Harris administration would do, and whether they would want to see fundamental changes as well.
Great, thank you. I think given the time we have left, I want to be sure we have enough time for our audience questions. So with that, let me hand over to our esteemed AFSA Executive Director, Asger Sigfusson, who will uh, do the Q&A portion of this broadcast. And over to you, Asger.
Thanks, Eric. Yes, we ask that you please type in any questions into the Q&A function in the Zoom window. And we've also received a few questions by email, so we'll do our best to sort of go back and forth and get to all the questions that we receive. The first question, Steve, it goes, did you hold a security clearance? At what level? And did anyone try to influence you by threatening to lift your access or clearance?
Yeah, that happened to the US AGM senior leadership, that their clearances were pulled. Now, I guess I should explain this a little bit wonky, but I think this particular audience would be interested in it. We do fill out the SF forms. We go through a background investigation, but VOA correspondents, editors, we have no access whatsoever to classified information. So, we are vetted, but I don't get anything that says that, I have a secret or a TS or whatever. And, I think in the course of my career, maybe I've been privy to a couple of, for official use only level documents, but that's really it. And we like it that way. I understand that we're working within federal government facilities, so just like a custodian who's going to go through a background check to be in the building, we're going to go through a background check. The previous administration contended that there were security issues with some of our foreign-born journalists in the different language services. As I mentioned, we have 48 language services, including Mandarin, Russian, Ukrainian, Korean, Farsi, etc. And the new appointees who came in canceled all the J1 visas for the number of non-citizen journalists we had working in those language services, and raised concerns. Michael Pack, who was the head of USAGM, said in interviews on some conservative podcasts that he went on that there could be spies in the building. And this harkened back, obviously, to the McCarthyism red bait era, which had also seen accusations thrown the way of VOA and Radio Free Europe that there was nests of communists in the services. And look, if there was some sort of spin for a particular political agenda, my copy, I write a story, it goes through two editors, and then it goes through a balance editor if there's anything that's political about it. So there are a lot of layers of internal checks and balances, and everything that's being done in all the different language services is being monitored. And so a lot of these accusations are ridiculous, but we understand the need to have some sort of proper vetting of somebody who's going to be writing stories, a correspondent for VOA, or be inside a federal government facility. I hope that answered the question, Asger.
Thanks, Steve. Here's the next one. It says, I recall seeing an AFSA statement about a board member who was kicked off Twitter. Do I recall correctly that that was you? And if so, can you discuss this?
Yeah, sure. I think I was kicked off Twitter twice after Elon Musk came in. The most notable incident involved an account called Elon Jet, which was run by, I think he was a teenager, who would post tracking, real-time tracking of where Elon Musk's private jet was, where it was flying, where it was landing, et cetera, et cetera. Musk took issue with that and banned the Elon Jet account, said it was putting out assassination coordinates for him. And some journalists noted this and were also immediately banned from Twitter. And then I wrote about the journalists getting banned for reporting about the ban of Elon Jet. And so I was banned too. And Musk insisted that, we were basically helping to perpetuate, dissemination of assassination coordinates about him, which is utterly ridiculous. I was a White House pool reporter traveling with the president on Air Force One, and we were authorized to say, Air Force One has taken off from here and has landed here at such and such a time. No one ever accused us of, the White House press of reporting assassination coordinates. So we were, there was a purgatory process, and certain tweets had to be deleted before we were allowed back on the platform. And so Elon Jet, you can now find it, I think, on Mastodon in the Fediverse, but it's not going to return to Twitter as long as Elon Jet is running the show. So that was the Twitter ban story.
Thank you, Steve. We have a question about journalists being imprisoned in other countries and used for sort of political purposes and prisoner exchanges. The questioner asks if you have any thoughts on this.
Oh, absolutely. It's a very risky situation that if you're working for VOA or RFE or RFA or the Wall Street Journal, that you can very easily see yourself essentially being taken hostage as a political pawn. And being a journalist, especially a journalist for like VOA or RFE, RFE, I should mention, they are surrogate broadcasters. They're under the US AGM umbrella, but RFE, Radio Liberty, and Radio Free Asia are not part of the federal government. They're surrogate broadcasters, but their funding does come through Congress. But of course, these nuances are lost. As I said, like in North Korea, everybody there thought, all of the American media is, under the CIA in some form or another. And, so it's very, very high risk, I think, these days, going into the PRC, countries like Russia, Belarus, and, we have freelance reporters that are thrown in jail all the time in Africa. It's become quite a frequent occurrence. Also, there are some countries in Southeast Asia where reporters can be arrested, jailed. RFA has some bloggers in Vietnam, for example, that have been jailed. And it just seems every week that there's not necessarily a US AGM journalist, but some sort of journalist that's being thrown in jail that's somehow has some link to US or Western media.
Thank you, Steve. The next one goes back into history a little bit. For those of us who worked for and deeply regret the demise of USIA, what is the current state of the US AGM Foreign Service? Does it have a future?
Yeah, great question. And of course, I'm the representative for the US AGM Foreign Service on the AFSA board. It's been a great honor to do that for the past, I think, 7 years. So I'm about to term out on the board. The numbers have been shrinking because we have closed more and more bureaus over the years and the decades. So there's just a handful of us now on the journalism side in the VOA Central newsroom. including civil service personnel who go on excursions as foreign service. And then more and more of the overseas radio transmitting sites are being shut down. Sri Lanka was closed down just a few years ago. And, and I understand that, obviously we have to keep up technologically and there's less of a demand for shortwave, but I have been an advocate for keeping these sites operational or at least in mothballs, because if you shut down a site and blow up the towers, you're not going to be able to get that back operating again over a weekend. And so the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine was a perfect example of this, where obviously in Russia, we don't have any affiliates anymore, local radio and TV stations. We can broadcast on satellite TV and local broadcasters. We have a joint venture, RFE and VOA, called Chaz Time, which is a Russian language 24/7 service. But think about it. How many people have been refugees from Ukraine moving into Poland and other places? I think it was a million people. These people are not going to strap a satellite dish to their back, when they're fleeing their homes because they're facing invasion or bombings. A battery operated radio is the way you're going to reach them. They may not have internet access as well. And the best way to get these signals long distance across borders is shortwave. AM radio is second best. And if you can have local FM transmitters in a particular area, we do that, for example, in the Rohingya refugee camps in Bangladesh, using FM to reach them in their language. But the shortwave is a relatively cheap and easy and flexible way to reach people in a very serious crisis. And of course, if global conflicts escalate and we're into a sort of World War III situation where satellites are being destroyed and the internet's being jammed, and local satellite TV is not necessarily going to be an option because of what I just stated. Radio is going to be the best way to reach these people. So I think it's something that should be reserved for times of crisis. I'm a ham radio guy. W7VOA is my call sign, and the motto of the ARRL, the Amateur Radio Relay League for ham radio, is when all else fails. Okay, so radio, I think, should continue to play a role.
Thank you. The next questioner prefaces his question by saying, written by someone who was a wannabe foreign correspondent before joining the Foreign Service. And the question is, can you talk about a particularly interesting or exciting experience you had as a foreign correspondent in the Foreign Service?
Well, since I joined VOA as a staffer, I was a contract reporter in Tokyo, but since, 2006, 2007, I've been a VOA foreign correspondent and a foreign service officer. So every experience I've had since then is wearing both of those hats. I covered some very interesting elections in places like Bangladesh and Nepal. I was on the scene of the Fukushima disaster in Japan. I went into North Korea for 10 days. As I mentioned, I covered Typhoon Haiyan, flying and rescue helicopters to reach people on the front lines who were receiving emergency aid, and reporting firsthand on the extensive devastation. I've covered coups in Thailand. I'm trying to think, what else. I was in Afghanistan. I did some TDY there. I covered the end of the civil war in Sri Lanka on the front lines under escort of the Sri Lankan army as they were massacring the remnants of the Tamil Tigers. So I talked a little bit about this in the book. The book is really not strictly a a biography, but I do have some stuff about Fukushima in there, but I don't think I went into the North Korea stuff at all. So yeah, the short answer is, you know, you name it. I've done it in the past nearly 20 years as an FSO and a foreign correspondent.
Thanks, Steve. The next question sort of goes into the book business aspect of all this. The question is, I suspect I'm not the only member of the Foreign Service who dreams of one day publishing a book. Can you talk about the process of writing the book, getting an agent, publication, editing, promotion, etc.?
Yeah, great question. First of all, the book was vetted twice by VOA's standards and practices editors. One standard practice editor left, another one came in. So there were two vettings of the book. I was not required to make any changes, but I wrote the book, keeping in mind that I am still a VOA correspondent and I'm you know, a foreign service officer. I kind of broke a lot of rules, not inside as a foreign service officer, but as an author, a writer, in the publication process. I did not get an agent. I realized, you know, I would be sort of spinning my wheels and wasting time, that it's probably easier to find a publisher than it is a reputable agent these days. So I didn't do that. And I cold contacted publishers, zeroing in on academic press, which I thought would be the most interested. You know, I didn't try to, because if you do want to hit some of the, you know, the top 5 publishers, you probably do need one of the top agents. I didn't want to self-publish. I didn't want to go with vanity press. There's some hybrid publishers out there now that are, you know, an interesting concept to look at. Look at one in Virginia called Amplify. I think especially for writers that are going to go out and do their own speaking tours, they're an attractive option. They have some interesting packages where you sort of pay for a lot of the costs up front and then keep much more on the back end than you would with a traditional publisher. But I was very, very lucky that Kent State University Press, the acquisitions editor who had been at Georgetown University Press, kind of got what I was trying to do with this book. And then internally, at the academic presses, they'll send your book out to 3 readers internally, you know, professors usually affiliated with that particular university, who will then give feedback on whether they would recommend that this book be published or not. So that's the process I did go through for this book.
All right, thank you. Next one is short and sweet. Should U.S. AGM's functions be folded into states' PD bureaucracy?
That's not for me to decide. Like I said, if the powers that be want to change things, that needs to be an act of Congress. And I think that the model works well that we have now. That's been my experience. I was not a VOA correspondent or even a freelance reporter back in the USIA days, so I have no experience. I think when a journalistic entity is not independent and not using professional journalists, it's going to be difficult to have the credibility, to have the skill sets, because you know, a lot of very good journalists are probably not going to work in that environment. And as you're well aware, there are government agencies, including the State Department and the White House itself. I mentioned this in the book. The White House had a radio feed service. I'm trying to remember which administration it was in, George W. Bush or maybe Clinton, somewhere around there, where, you know, where they were sending out radio voice reports and got smaller radio stations around the United States to run it. Remember, we're an external broadcasting service. We're not trying to influence or target U.S. citizens or the American public, whether they're here or abroad. And you know, I've observed what state has tried to do with GEC, It seems to have been a sort of evolving mission. I'll let others decide whether it has been effective, and I think they've had a sort of a pivot with that. So trying to do it, especially starting something up from scratch, I think is very, very challenging. And but if you delve into Project 2025, I believe they're pretty explicit in that USAGM VOA should either be under NSC or state. I would see being under NSC to be especially quite problematic for obvious reasons.
Thanks, Steve. We have time for a couple more questions. The next one is, before joining the Foreign Service, I was a journalist, and I remember being influenced by the early 1990s CNN reporting from Iraq. What encouraged you to become a journalist?
Yeah, great question. I don't know. I think I always had it in my blood that I was going to be in journalism or media, broadcasting. I was just fascinated with the whole thing as a child. I guess until the age of 10 or 11, I thought I would try to be a Major League Baseball announcer. I took journalism, I mentioned, talk about this in the book, as an elective in seventh grade. Wasn't really sure what journalism was. Fell in love with the process, and from that point on, I thought probably I'm going to do something in journalism or broadcasting. I thought maybe I'd be behind the scenes. I was fascinated with the technology as well. But by the time I got to high school, I think I was pretty much set. And I started during high school working in two local radio stations in Las Vegas in their newsrooms. And unfortunately, there aren't many local newsrooms, radio stations doing news anymore, except for public radio stations. And so that was what really launched my career. It's just fascinating. You get to, do something a little bit different every single day. And you don't have to be extremely knowledgeable about any subject. You're not necessarily an expert, but you're wide, if not deep. And I just maybe with I have a short attention span on certain things, and devoting myself just to physics for the rest of my life or just to law, I'd probably lose interest. But being able to talk about physics and law and doing a little bit of research and being able to talk one-on-one with some of the greatest experts in the world about any particular subject is really a rare opportunity. And I loved it, and I still love it.
All right, the last question is actually a comment, which is not something we usually like, but we figured you might like this one,
Okay.
which is from a fellow ham radio enthusiast. Thank you for mentioning it.
Great.
All right, and
Put
now
your
I'll
call
pass it back
sign
to
in
Eric.
the chat, and we'll follow
We'll
up,
pick that
talk
up.
to each other on the air.
We will grab it. Eric, all yours to wrap up.
Thank you, Asgir. First of all, thank you, Steve, for a great discussion and a great book, and for all your contributions to telling America's story to the world, but also getting the story right, sometimes under fire, sometimes under pressure. Also, thank you for your contributions to the Foreign Service and to AFSA and the AFSA board. I do think a lot of people who tuned in today may not have realized that the Foreign Service includes people at USAGM and VOA, and that is a legacy of the late lamented US Information Agency. A lot of us hope that we will get back to a more energetic, well-funded American effort to tell America's story. But in the meantime, what you're doing is critical, and the role of free journalism is critical as we head into what's likely to be a fairly bumpy ride for our country and the world. So with that, I want to thank you for writing this great book, for spending the time with us. I want to thank everybody who joined in for watching and for their questions, and AFSA for doing this great book notes series. And I want to wish everybody a great rest of the day and rest of the week. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Asgir. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. And as we say in the business, stay tuned.